Now that we understand how arrays work in JavaScript, let's learn about some properties and methods that may be helpful when dealing with arrays. And I'm going to begin by creating a simple array called myArray that includes 3 elements, the number 1, the number 3, and the number 2. The first property that we're going to want to look at when dealing with arrays is the length property. This is very similar to the length property that we learned about when dealing with strings, but in the case of arrays, it doesn't count the number of characters, it counts the number of elements within our array. So here, my array length should be 3, and we simply call this property by specifying the name of our array and then .length. The next thing that we're going to want to learn about when dealing with arrays is the sort method. And the sort method is called by calling the name of our array and then .sort. Now, because it's a method rather than a property, we're going to want to include opening and closing parentheses after calling it. And this simply sorts our array in ascending order according to the comparisons that occur between the primitive data types if possible. Now, in order to sort an array that consists of composite data types, we'll have to write our own custom sorting function, which we'll get to later in this class when we talk about functions. But for now, assuming that our array has just primitive data types, it'll properly sort our numbers in ascending order. The next method that we're going to look at is the push method. And the push method simply pushes a new element onto our array, and it pushes it to the end of our array. So in this case, we've already sorted our array, so our array is now in the order 1, 2, 3, and pushing the number 4 onto our array will result in an array of size 4 that is 1, 2, 3, 4 as its elements. Then the pop method pops the last element from our array. So in this case, it's simply undoing what we did in the previous method. Now, the pop method returns the element that it pops off, whereas the push method pushes on a new element and returns the new length of the array. So when we print out the myArray.push and the myArray.pop methods, as we do in here, we log them to the console, they're both going to return the number 4, but understand that in the case of the push method, it's returning 4, it's printing out 4 because that's the new length of our array. In the pop method, it's returning 4 because that's the value that it just popped off of our array. Moving on, we have the shift method, and the shift method is very similar to the pop method, but instead of popping the last element of our array, it's going to pop and return, or it's going to remove and return the first element of our array and simply shift all remaining elements down. Moving on, we have the unshift method, which kind of corresponds to the push method. But again, instead of pushing an element onto our end of the array, it's going to add an element to the beginning of our array and shift the remaining elements after it up 1 index. So in this case, we're going to add the element 0, and we're going to shift the remaining elements up an index. And similarly, this returns the new length of our array, whereas shift returns the element that we just shifted off. The final method we're going to take a look at is the splice method. And the splice method is a little bit more complex than previous methods we looked at, but bear with me as we walk through it. It consists of several parameters. The first 2 parameters are required, and any subsequent parameters are optional. The first parameter is the index that we want to start changing our array at. The second parameter is how many elements we want to remove from our array beginning at that index. So in this case, I've specified that I want to start changing my array at index 1. I don't want to remove any elements from my array, but this third parameter and all subsequent parameters that I add are new elements that I want to add to my array beginning at this index. So in this case, what I've specified is that I want to add the number 1 at index 1, and I don't want to remove any elements. So it's simply going to make room. It's going to, in essence, shift all the elements to the right that are at the right, that are at index 2 or greater, to make room for this new element that I want to add. Now, we can also use this method, this splice method, to remove elements that are not either at the beginning or the end of our array. And we do that by simply specifying the index that we want to start removing elements at, and then specify how many elements we want to remove. So these are the two ways to use the splice method, and of course we can use them in conjunction as well. So for instance, I could have specified that I want to start at index 1, I want to remove one element, and I essentially want to replace that element with this new element. So play around with the splice method a little bit to get comfortable with it, but for now we're going to go to our browser and check out what all these print in our console. When we call the length property, it returns the length of our array, which beginning our array length is 3. Then when we sort the array, it sorts it in ascending order. So in this case, it sorts it from 1 to 3. When we push an element onto our array, it returns the new length of our array. It's just coincidence in this case that the element we pushed on is also the size of our array. However, when we pop our array, we pop off the last element of our array, and it returns that element that we popped off. And when we shift our array, similarly, it shifts the first element of our array, returns that element to us, and keeps the remaining elements in the array. Then when we unshift our array, it's similar to when we push an element onto our array. When we unshift, it returns the new length of our array, and it adds that element that we passed through in this parameter to the beginning of our array. Then the splice methods change our array, and it returns whatever the elements were that we removed as a result of the splice. In this case, we didn't actually remove any elements because we specified 0 in the second parameter, but we added the element 1 at index 1, and so we increased our array length to 4 and placed the 1 right here at index 1. Then in the second use of the splice method, we did remove an element from our array. We removed one element starting at index 0, so it removed this first element, this 0 value, and the result is that we have an element or an array of 3 elements long that is effectively the same array we had when we sorted it. So pretty cool, and hopefully these methods make sense. Again, I would encourage you to play around with them and mess with them and get more comfortable with them on your own. But for now, we're going to move on to the next section.